Hey guys, welcome to this week's question. I hope that you are enjoying this format and enjoying these videos. Again, if you want to submit a question to be answered on one of these short videos, please email us or message us on Instagram, and we will be happy to answer your question. This week's question is a question I received on Instagram, and it is, how do you deal with the taken in hand being kind of off, but not breaking any rules? So, Coda?
So I kind of interpret this. I hope that I'm interpreting your question the right way. But when you say off, meaning she's not breaking any rules, but maybe she's being a little sassy, maybe she's right on that line of being disrespectful. How do you handle that? Well, I will tell you, this is still a journey for me a little bit. Sometimes I tend to, and I don't mean to, it kind of ignore it a little bit. This is an area where I I'm not very good at standing up for myself a little bit, if you will, or really saying, "Hey, you're crossing the line a little bit." And so I appreciate this question because this actually has happened recently. So I'm actually in the process of trying to retrain myself in this area. So getting to your question though now is, how do I handle that? Well, the thing that I'm working on trying to do is not in an ugly way, but in a very precise, or maybe you could use the word stern, maybe
Direct.
that, direct. Thank you. That's the word that I'm looking for. Let them know. Look, yes, you haven't violated any rules, but you're right on that line. The way you're acting, perhaps what you're saying, perhaps your body language that you're using, it's striking me as off. It's striking me as there's a problem here. You haven't violated any rules, but you're close to violating one. You need to be careful. You need to not do this. And if you're in need of some type of discipline or a maintenance spanking or something in order to correct this behavior, then offer that. Do that. But you want to be very concise, and you don't want to let it slide though. And I can tell you, as the head of household, it's easier just to let it slide. Like, they didn't violate any rules. I don't want to deal with this right now, and let it slide. However, what I've found is, if you let it slide, it gets worse, and then you actually don't do your taken in hand any favors, because maybe they weren't trying to violate any rules, but eventually they do.
It really does affect my ability to follow the rules and to have a good attitude when I don't feel like my head of household is taking me into consideration and correcting those behaviors and those attitudes. I think that it's really important to have that direct conversation, almost like a lecture,
Yes, yeah, that's good. Yeah, I like that.
where you pull them aside and you have a formal conversation, a formal lecture time as a warning. And I know that in our relationship, if I need a maintenance, or even if I need discipline without a rule violation in order to get myself back to a place to be able to come under his authority, Coda would much rather me ask for that because that's more productive to our relationship than us playing this game where he's not addressing it and I'm continuing to have a more and more sour attitude. And then eventually I do pop off with some disrespect, or I do just forego following the rules because I have a blase attitude towards them. And then it becomes an issue where he has to step in and give correction. And that's a more serious situation in our relationship. And so, really being proactive about addressing those with a lecture, with a warning, maybe even imposing, say, you're kind of feeling off right now to me. What is going on? Have that conversation, say, you know what, we're going to have a maintenance spanking in order to correct this. So, even as the head of household, offering that, like, sometimes I want Coda to offer those points of mild correction without me always having to ask. And part of good communication is it going both ways. So, you know, as the head of household, you can impose those mild corrections, obviously, be open to your taken in hand asking for those corrections. Um, but yeah, don't let it just go, because usually problems in many areas get worse if you ignore them.
What I've realized is if you ignore things long enough, right, then they fester and they become a problem later. So what I thought I was getting better at, but I actually realized I have a lot more work to do in this area, is tackling these things head on. Because here's what happens. And Ari already kind of touched on this a little bit, but you're irritated. You really don't, or that whatever the taken in hand is doing has irritated you a little bit, but you're maybe tired or whatever, and you just don't want to deal with it right now. So you let it go. So then again, it gets worse and worse, and then eventually maybe they do violate the rules, and now you're in a punishment. Which, if you would have just addressed it in the first place, maybe you didn't get to a punishment, which now is a little worse. It's on you. It's worse for you, and it's worse for them because they already violated the rules. Now you have to follow through with that punishment, and you want to take the adequate time that we've talked about in order to make the punishment effective and everything. But that's that time that you maybe didn't need to take. The punishment would have never gotten there if you'd have just addressed it and dealt with the little bit of the irritation rather than when it got really, really bad. And so that's what I'm learning is if I'll just deal with it first and just say, hey, you haven't violated any rules, but you're right on the line here between being very disrespectful and this is the way you're coming off, and I don't like the attitude I'm getting or whatever it is, and address it, then she has the opportunity to correct it, or you have the opportunity again too to have a discussion to where maybe either you suggest or she asks for a maintenance spanking or something in order to help her feel better and get back on track. And then you avoided having to deal with a punishment and all of those kind of things. That's a good thing.
The way I like to think about it is offering like a gentle correction. And what I mean by gentle doesn't mean that you're not being direct, that you're not being maybe stern in the way you handle it, but more about, you know, I like to think of the imagery of like a shepherd with a sheep walking along a path, and he's using his staff to kind of just veer the sheep either direction. If they start to get off the path a little bit, they just kind of tap them along to get them back onto the path. They don't wait for them to be in the middle of the field that's completely off course. They just are there right behind them, gently correcting them back onto the path so that they don't get completely off course. And that's the way I feel like a head of household should kind of look at his relationship with his taken in hand, especially when she's kind of feeling off, especially when she's having a hard time um, just following the routines and rules, and not necessarily violating any of the rules, but she's just having kind of this attitude that says that she's not taking her role or the rules or your authority very seriously. Then you just offer that gentle correction to get her back on path, and that can take the form of a lecture, that can take the form of maintenance, that can take the form of even maybe a mild spanking, or I like to call those mild spankings more of like correction rather than punishment.
Yeah.
And so really to offer that just to kind of correct her, get her back on path, get her into a better mental space and a better attitude. And that is really like, that is key. And really addressing those things in the moment as at the start. Like, don't let them fester for too long. Like, it, as soon as you realize, hey, something's off here, something doesn't feel right, that is when you address it right away.
Think of it no differently. This just occurred to me. Think of it no differently when you don't want your kids playing out in the street, but you see them. They're not in the street yet, but you see them playing out front. They're thinking about it. In fact, maybe if you've got two kids, maybe it's the youngest one. I don't know. Maybe the oldest one. They kind of put a foot out there and they're just kind of tapping it along the street. Or, oh no, the ball accidentally went out on the street a little bit. I may want to go get it. and you see that and you call them over and you say, look, I don't know if that was on purpose or that was on accident, that the ball kind of went into the street there a little bit and you guys stayed there a little too long. I want to remind you, I don't want you playing in the street. If I catch you in the street, remember, this is the consequence. Don't go in the street. It's just that quick, direct warning. Hey, remember, I told you not to go in the street. I know you haven't gone there yet, but don't go there because you know what's going to happen. I think it's very similar uh, illustration there of what you want to do.
And I think that that's a good way to think about it too, because when you pull your taken a hand aside and you give them that lecture, if you haven't decided to impose a maintenance, if they don't ask for maintenance, then you can remind them, like, hey, this is what I am seeing and I don't like it. This is unacceptable. You need to change your attitude or we will have a mild correction tonight. And unless there's a rule break and then that turns into punishment, but to offer some form of consequence for not correcting, taking a corrective action after receiving that lecture is important too.
Absolutely. So I hope that answers your question, that was helpful.
Yes. And again, if you want to submit a question to be answered, the best way to do that is through email or a direct message on Instagram. You can find our email and our Instagram handle in the description box, as well as a link to our Patreon if you want more bonus content like this. All right, guys, we will talk to you next week.
Thanks again.